Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. And welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that during his war with Nicholas Biddle and the bank, Andrew Jackson had trouble finding political allies who supported his aggressive stance on removing the deposits from the federal bank? And that over time, this war over the bank seemed to be a personal battle between President Andrew Jackson and the director of the bank, Nicholas Biddle. And that this divisive decision Andrew Jackson made to move ahead with destroying the Bank of the United States caused quite a ripple effect throughout the American economy for years to come, setting up his eventual successor, Martin Van Buren, for failure. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will cover that and more in episode 128, Death of the Bank and the Birth of the Whigs. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 128. The book recommendation for this week is The Bank War, Andrew Jackson, Nicholas Biddle, and the Fight for American Finance by Paul Kahan. I believe it's pronounced Kahan, Kahan. Really good stuff, very accessible. He takes a very complex issue with this fight over the bank and makes it pretty digestible. So if you are interested in what we're covering today, which I think is a really fascinating topic, and if you're interested in it and want to learn more about it, I recommend you checking that out. Sorry for no episode last week. Unfortunately, life got in the way. Ran into some technical issues with my computer and all that stuff. So I apologize for that, but we are back this week. And unfortunately, that'll happen every now and then as I try and juggle life and work and family and podcasting. So thank you for your patience there. One last thing to get to before we jump in. One of our listeners, Patrick Miller, who's actually told me he's been binging the podcast and is up to, at least when he sent the message to me last week, was up to episode 80. So I'm sure he's further along now, pointed out that I have made literally multiple mistakes about the number of votes in the Electoral College. I had no idea I had made these mistakes. Apparently, at one point, I said that there were 537 votes in the Electoral College, and then I corrected myself by incorrectly saying that there were 535. So Patrick, thank you so much for pointing that out. There are, as Patrick reminded me, a bit embarrassingly, by the way, the fact that I messed this up twice. There are 538 votes in the Electoral College. Definitely 538. And you would think that that would be top of mind, since I read a lot of information off of 538, which is a website that I follow and have been following for years, which is named 538 because of the number of votes in the Electoral College. So I apologize for that. That's why you need 270 to win, because 270 is a majority of 538. So, if you were a bit curious, as I incorrectly mentioned how many electoral votes there were in the Electoral College presently in those episodes, you had a right to be, because it is 538. Thank you, Patrick, once again for pointing that out. All right, so last episode we covered the election of 1832 and the re-election of Andrew Jackson. We discussed the failure of Jackson's opponents to organize and galvanize support in one party or around one candidate, which helped to lead to Jackson's overwhelming re-election victory. As I mentioned at the end of episode 127, this won't be a mistake his opponents repeat, as they joined together to create the Whig Party to try to beat the Jacksonians in the election of 1834, the congressional election, and then the presidential election of 1836. But that's a story for another day. Andrew Jackson has won re-election. He's riding high and feels as though he has been given, through the vote of the people, the green light to do things his way. He had already vetoed the rechartering proposal of the National Bank. So, next up on his agenda, destroy it altogether. So as we already know, the veto of the rechartering of the Bank of the United States was the primary issue in the election of 1832, thanks to Henry Clay and Nicholas Biddle. Clay tried his best to make the election all about Jackson's veto of the bank, and for brief periods of time, Clay was pretty confident that it could work. But Jackson's, well, mostly Van Buren's, political organization in the Democratic Party proved to be too much for Clay and the National Republicans to overcome. By the end of the 1832 election, not only was Jackson still in the White House, but Congress was heavily weighted toward the pro-Jackson Democratic Republicans. With his re-election victory in 1832, Andrew Jackson entered his second term with the full intent to do some damage to the bank. While its charter technically didn't expire until 1836, Jackson's veto of its renewal made it clear what he thought about it, and with his dominating election victory, he believed he had been given a mandate from the people to take action against it. With whispers in his ear that Biddle had been using bank funds to support opposition to Jackson's re-election, Jackson decided to take a public position against the legitimacy of the bank. In his 1832 State of the Union, Jackson wondered aloud whether the Bank of the United States was a safe place to keep the, quote, people's money, and called for an investigation of the bank. The House committee that inspected the concern that Jackson had issued a 4-3 ruling that the deposits were safe and there was no such corruption. The dissenting opinion, led by Jackson's buddy and future president James K. Polk, pulled no punches, and it was clear that this issue over the legitimacy of the bank was not going away anytime soon. With the committee reporting a clean bill of health to Biddle and the bank, Jackson's only remaining option seemed to be to use executive action to remove the funds from the Bank of the United States. With the nullification crisis behind him, Jackson was able to turn all of his attention to the bank, and that was bad news for Biddle and his bank allies. And for the record, this decision by Jackson to remove the deposits from the bank, this was a big deal. The reason why Biddle was so confident about the status of the bank, even following Jackson's veto, was because of these federal deposits. Control over these deposits made the bank incredibly powerful. With these deposits, the bank had assets that allowed it to make loans. Now, technically, the control over the deposits fell under the Treasury Department, which technically was controlled by the executive branch. Therefore, in the end, Jackson could make a pretty strong argument that he was, when it came down to it, fully in charge of these deposits. But even with this knowledge, Biddle could not imagine a scenario in which Jackson would act in such a way, stating that, quote, they will not dare to remove the deposits. If the deposits are withdrawn, there will be a declaration of war which cannot be recalled. But, of course, as we know, war is exactly what Jackson was after. In February of 1833, Jackson received word of what he believed was Biddle's plan. Over the next 2 years, the bank was going to gradually call in all of its financial responsibilities. Without getting into all the details, the idea would be to force the state banks to pay out the specie, or the hard coin, putting them in a tough spot, and eventually damaging the national economy. It would be at this point that the people would look to the Bank of the United States to swoop in and save them by normalizing the currency once again, which they would happily do. just as they were getting, rechartered. Now, Jackson didn't have any evidence that the bank was definitely going to do that, but he was willing to believe it. Jackson hated banks and distrusted them greatly. He viewed the Bank of the United States as corrupt, with men like Nicholas Biddle in a seat of power that, by the way, no one had ever voted him into. This was as anti-democratic as it gets in the mind of Andrew Jackson. Now, the reason that Jackson was looking to remove the federal deposits from the Bank of the United States was because he was planning on putting them into private banks that were more friendly to the administration. But this would be a massive disruption to American society, and it would be a decision that would be incredibly divisive, more or less forcing his cabinet members and political allies to side with him or against him. That's a tough spot to put people in. In preparation for such a move, in the summer of 1833, Treasury Auditor Amos Kendall traveled around the nation looking for banks that fit the description. He was able to find 7 banks that were not only friendly to the administration, but also were banks where they could place federal funds. By the end of the year, he had identified almost 24 banks that he believed would work. While Kendall was out vetting these state banks, Roger B. Taney, Jackson's attorney general, informed him that his suspicions of Biddle were true. Taney told Jackson that Biddle was actively working to manipulate the money supply. And not only that, but Taney even accused Biddle of using the funds from the people, mind you, to support Jackson's opponents in the election of 1832, something that Jackson and Taney believed to be an unforgivable offense. But even with these concerns about Biddle's behavior, not everyone was on board with the idea of removing deposits from the bank. Martin Van Buren, hoping to maintain enough popularity for the presidential bid in 1836, refused to publicly support this plan, and Treasury Secretary Lewis McLean warned Jackson that his removal of the funds could result in a, quote, economic catastrophe. But that's not what Jackson wanted to hear. And he had been annoyed with McLean for a while up to that point, since he was, boys with Nicholas Biddle. So Jackson removed him as Treasury Secretary and replaced him with William Duane, someone who Jackson believed hated the bank enough for Jackson's taste. But even William Duane wasn't totally on board with Jackson's plan. Duane was worried that the removal of the deposits would provoke Biddle to retaliate against the state banks, leading to a financial panic. Jackson replied to Duane, basically telling him that his concerns proved Jackson's point about the bank in the first place. Jackson basically said 2 things. Number 1, it's a big problem if the bank has enough power to have such an impact on the state banks. And number 2, it's an even bigger problem if the people running the bank, like Nicholas Biddle, are willing to cause a panic in the nation out of spite and an attempt to win a power struggle. In Jackson's mind, he said there's even more reason to remove the deposits and weaken its authority sooner rather than later. Duane informed Jackson that according to the bank's charter, he, along with Congress, technically had the authority over the bank's deposits. But Jackson reminded Duane that Duane worked for Jackson, and Jackson didn't agree. He countered to Duane that he, in fact, should be in charge of it in the end, because the people had spoken in the election of 1832, and Duane was expected to defer to his boss, Andrew Jackson, on the matter of bank deposits. Duane pushed back, once again telling Jackson that Congress should be consulted about such drastic plans to impact the bank, but Jackson would have none of it. In an attempted compromise, Martin Van Buren offered to Jackson that he should take advice from his former Treasury Secretary and delay action on the bank until after the congressional elections in 1834. But once again, Andrew Jackson was not willing to wait. Jackson claimed that if they did that, Biddle and his cronies would once again use the bank as a political prop to try to influence the congressional midterm elections of 1834. And if they were successful enough and got, say, 2/3 of Congress, they would be able to override his veto and recharter the bank. This was not a chance that Jackson was willing to take. On top of this, another thing that's important to keep in mind when it comes to the timeline here, When Treasury Auditor Amos Kendall traveled around the country looking for state banks that would support their plan, those that said they would informed Kendall that if Jackson was going to remove the deposits, he better do it immediately, because once word gets out that they were willing to support Jackson, Biddle would move to try to harm these banks. So if they're going to do it, they need to do it now. As Jackson prepared to remove the deposits from the bank, it was becoming more and more clear to many that this was the hill Jackson was prepared to die on. He truly believed he had gotten a mandate from the people to disempower the bank, and that was exactly what he was going to do. He believed in the democratic process, and he was going to follow it through. And to be clear, Jackson 100% believed this was a necessary fight. When Secretary of War Lewis Cass floated the possibility that Jackson's decision would be met with a lot of resistance on both sides of the aisle, and that Congress could pass a joint resolution preventing it, and with a 2/3 vote could override a possible veto of that resolution, Jackson claimed that if that were to happen, he would, quote, resign the presidency and return to the Hermitage. Jackson, frustrated that his new Secretary of Treasury, Duane, was dragging his feet, announced in the Washington Globe that he would be removing the deposits on or before October 1st, 1833. A couple days later, Secretary Duane was fired. Lewis McLean, the former Secretary of Treasury, who had since been moved to Secretary of State when he wouldn't get on board with this plan, along with Secretary of War Lewis Cass, met with Jackson and recommended that they both resign as they so strongly disagreed with his decision. Jackson convinced them to stay in his cabinet, and they came to an agreement that both men would withhold from publicly speaking in support of the bank. The new Secretary of Treasury was a former Attorney General Roger B. Taney, who hated the bank about as much as Jackson did, and had been in Jackson's ear about the evils of the bank for a while now. Taney created a plan to remove the banks over the next year in 4 quarterly installments. Because so many of the state banks that would be receiving the funds were transparently pro-Jackson, it seemed a little too corrupty for many. These banks were given the derisive nickname, quote, pet banks, which made sense since many of them funded pet projects that were conceived by members of the Jackson administration. As one could imagine, Nicholas Biddle was not too happy with the impending destruction of the bank. He wasn't totally surprised by it, as he had heard rumors that it may happen, and even mused privately that if he needed to buy support, he could, explaining that, quote, in half an hour, I can remove all the constitutional scruples in the District of Columbia. Half a dozen presidencies of bank branches, a dozen cashierships, 50 clerkships, 100 directorships, to worthy friends who have no character and no money. But Biddle didn't go through with that plan, thinking that Jackson may get cold feet. So instead, he urged Congress to do something about Jackson and Taney. Biddle pleaded with them to pass a joint resolution to restore the deposits, the exact thing the Secretary of War Lewis Cass had warned Jackson about. But unfortunately for Biddle and the bank, he was unable to find enough allies in Congress. In what seemed to be an attitude brought upon by political convenience more than anything else, Henry Clay, who had gotten crushed by Jackson in the election of 1832, seemed to be no longer interested in publicly fighting Jackson over the bank. Now that the election was over and he'd gotten his butt kicked, he had no desire to start the fight all over again. With Clay out of the picture, Biddle gave up on any hopes of a joint resolution in 1833. With Jackson's veto, the electoral victory of 1832, the end of the bank's charter approaching, and the plan to remove deposits, there was no way that Biddle could ignore the reality that the Bank of the United States, as he knew it, was likely going to cease to exist eventually. Biddle was not just furious, but vengeful and personally affronted, venting that, quote, this worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken. Biddle met with the bank's board of directors a week after Jackson said he was going to move the federal deposits on October 7, 1833, to devise a plan to try to salvage the bank's power, although we all know it was too little, too late. Biddle announced that the bank would be raising interest rates in the coming months in order to stockpile some reserves. They were also going to reduce discounts and call in loans. And a lot of this made sense. The bank was really important and was critical to many prioritized initiatives from the administration, like maintaining a uniform currency, retiring the public debt in a short period, and being able to lend out money for commercial enterprises. I mean, these were important things the bank needed to be able to do. Biddle claimed publicly that he was just trying to strengthen the bank for the uncertain times ahead. But really, he was trying to gain as much leverage as he could to prevent Jackson from destroying it. Biddle also had some more vindictive plans in mind, too. He knew that in order to get a recharter of the bank, he was going to have to play politics, something he had tried to avoid doing his entire career. But it was to a point, or so he believed, that the ends would justify the means. Unfortunately, the means was to create financial distress across the nation in order to scare people into supporting the bank again. Biddle's economic policy changes for the bank tightened credit like he wanted and caused a ripple effect across the nation like he expected. Banks and businesses closed down, people were out of work, and the U.S. dollar was becoming deflated. Biddle was now taking the fight to Jackson. As people began to beg Biddle to be more liberal with his policies, it became more and more clear to many that Biddle was never going to budge, and that he was going to see this through to the end. He was gaining leverage, and even though he was destroying people's lives in the process, he was not going to give that leverage up. It was at this point that it was clear to many that this fight between Biddle and Jackson was a last man standing, and the last man standing would win. And Jackson knew he was going to win, complaining to Martin Van Buren that, quote, "This bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." But one could make a solid argument that Jackson had underestimated Biddle. Biddle knew how to play the political game, and he encouraged people to petition Congress and President Jackson to back off if they wanted the panic to end. That's exactly what happened. Petitions to Congress flooded in, demanding that Jackson relent, and Jackson felt like he was taking shots from all angles. James Alexander Hamilton, son of Alexander Hamilton, and strangely a fellow supporter of the destruction of the bank, the thing that his dad, invented, even lamented to Jackson that the state of New York was, quote, really in very great distress, nay, even to the point of general bankruptcy. John C. Calhoun also hadn't slowed down in his public deriding of President Jackson, except now he was speaking out against Jackson for another overt expansion of executive power, claiming that Jackson's action with the bank was unconstitutional too, just like the tariff. But even with the backlash and fear from politicians all over the country, Jackson was confident that the people were behind him. In fact, he was so confident that he often wouldn't even entertain complaints from people, referring them to Nicholas Biddle, explaining that this financial panic wasn't Jackson's fault, it was Biddle's. The blood wasn't on his hands, it was on Biddle's. Jackson would say, quote, "Go to Nicholas Biddle. We have no money here, gentlemen. Biddle has all the money. He has millions of specie in his vaults, at this moment lying idle, and yet you come to me to save you from breaking. I tell you, gentlemen, it's all politics." Jackson maintained a steadfast belief that what he was doing was right. His belief and conviction allowed him to ignore what was actually happening to the economy. Jackson complained that, quote, "There is no real general distress. It is only with those who live by borrowing, trade on loans, and the gamblers in stocks." Which, by the way, Jackson conveniently chose to ignore that he used to do all of that stuff, and actually that's how he built his businesses in the first place. But it's neither here nor there. Jackson decided he was going to cut off all conversations with him about money. If people wanted to bitch and moan about the economy, they could talk to Biddle. After all, In Jackson's mind, it was his fault in the first place. As I mentioned at the end of episode 127, the actions and attitude of Andrew Jackson created a new sense of opposition, leading to the creation of the Whig Party, which was primarily made up of national Republicans, anti-Masons, evangelical reformers, and some nullifiers. This newly formed Whig Party saw itself hit the national stage in the midterm congressional elections of 1834 and decided that they were going to fight back against Jackson's actions with a formal censure. Henry Clay, now willing to go public with his fight against Jackson, led the charge, describing Jackson as a, quote, backwoods Caesar. Jackson responded, of course he did, by claiming that Clay was as, quote, reckless and as full of fury as a drunken man in a brothel. This mammoth of power and corruption must die. The monster, the bank, must perish. Led by Clay, the U.S. Senate voted to censure President Jackson 26-20 for two primary reasons. Number one, the removal of the bank's deposits, and number two, the firing of Secretary of Treasury William Duane. And you may be wondering, what is a censure and what is the purpose of it? Well, that's a great question. A censure is a formal and public group condemnation of an individual, and of course, in this case, President Andrew Jackson. And this is, by the way, the most famous censure in American history, the censure of Jackson during the Bank War. Basically, the censure is used when the actions of that individual run counter to the acceptable standards of behavior established by the group. In its most simple terms, a censure is a formal state of disapproval. So when a member of Congress or a president does something that is very concerning to the members of the House or Senate, but isn't bad enough to impeach them and remove them from office, a censure is used. In response to the senatorial censure, the House of Representatives passed their own resolution on April 4th in favor of the removal of deposits, which is unsurprising since the House was so heavily weighted pro-Jacksonians. The House validated that they believed Jackson had done the correct thing. It voted to allow the pet banks to continue to serve in their capacity, and it called for an investigation into the bank to see whether or not Biddle had deliberately caused the economic panic, supporting something Jackson had called for a year and a half earlier. Jackson was elated. He believed that the resolutions passed by the Jacksonian-controlled House all but guaranteed that eventually the bank would be done. The bank's days were numbered. But of course, you probably could have assumed that this investigation they called for wasn't really going to happen. When the investigators arrived in Philadelphia, the directors of the bank gave them the runaround and didn't let them actually investigate anything. At this point, things began to get ugly. Since Jackson had removed the deposits from the bank, Biddle reasoned that the bank was no longer obligated to function as a national bank, since the federal funds were removed. Therefore, the bank would primarily prioritize the interest of the stockholders. Once word leaked out that Biddle was going to act in such a seemingly selfish way, public opinion of him, unsurprisingly, began to decline further and further. As the calendar moved into 1834, the economy began to pick back up, and Biddle received more and more criticism for his policies. Eventually, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1834 in June, which eliminated the devaluation of coin and helped to end the brief recession. Over time, as Biddle received more backlash for his petty war on Jackson, Jackson's public stance on potentially being open on establishing a new bank faded away, and those efforts were abandoned once and for all. The Democrats crushed the Whigs in the congressional election of 1834, and it was becoming more and more clear that the tide of public opinion had turned against Biddle and the bank. Various Whig politicians began to abandon Biddle and the bank and tried to distance themselves from the controversy, publicly at least. In January of 1835, Jackson was riding high and seemed to have won the battle. Halfway through his second term, things were looking good. Through a steady method of making regular payments, his vetoes of unnecessary legislation, and eliminating the misuse of funds, Andrew Jackson had paid off the entire national debt for the first and still only time in United States history. Riding Jackson's momentum, James K. Polk, as we've pointed out, who was an ardent pro-Jacksonian, was elected Speaker of the House of Representatives. By the way, Polk is going to be president sooner rather than later. To put an exclamation point on what seemed to be a political victory for Jackson, pro-Jackson Senator Thomas Benton introduced a resolution to expunge Jackson's censure, which they did in a vote of 25-19. Jackson, ever the partisan, then hosted a large dinner to celebrate, inviting all of his expungers over to have a party. Over the course of his presidency, Jackson had gone to war with the bank and won. Not only that, but the economy was growing at an unprecedented rate of 6.6% per year from 1830 to 1837. In February of 1836, with the dissolution of the bank on the horizon, Nicholas Biddle made a desperate play to salvage what he could of the bank, making it a private corporation under Pennsylvania law. But alas, his attempt to keep the bank alive failed, and he resigned as director of the bank in 1839. Biddle was then sued for almost $25 million, and while he avoided criminal conviction, he was involved in various lawsuits for most of the rest of his life. After investigations exposed a pretty incredible amount of fraud in the bank, it was officially shut down on April 4th, 1841. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider just how divided and partisan the nation was becoming during this period. As we can see, the cult of personality that followed Andrew Jackson was really starting to take hold in the U.S., partially because of his personality, and political division was once again becoming the new normal. But Jackson's tendency to make unilateral decisions did not always pay off for him, and the impact of withdrawing the federal funds from the bank and destroying the bank altogether caused serious damage to the U.S. economy, damage that he will try his best to mitigate in the final years of his presidency while he angles to get his vice president, Martin Van Buren, into the White House as his successor. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. A Teacher's History of the United States is supported by its fans at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Those of you who are able to contribute, I can't thank you enough, as it keeps this podcast going and allows me to continue to make time to try to provide you with the most in-depth and comprehensive history of the United States that I possibly can. A sincere thank you to all of our patrons, period, and especially those at the Teacher's Pet and History Nerd level who help sponsor the show. Their names can be found on the website at ateachershistory.com. And a super special thanks to our patrons at the History Nerd level. We couldn't do the show without you. Rita Huckle, Tammy Smith, Nora McLaughlin, and Pamela Caldwell. Thanks, Mom.